My name is Billy Harfosh, broadcasting from beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona at Dave Pratt Star Worldwide Networks Studios. Today, I am angry, I am sad, I am confused, and yes, I am scared. I'm wondering if you feel the same way. We have a war that continues in Ukraine. We have a new war in the Middle East that is only getting worse by the hour, which experts say will escalate into a regional war between Iran, its proxies, Israel, and yes, quite possibly even the United States. Iran is backed by China and Russia. Israel, of course, is backed by the United States and its allies. This could get messy. We see all the time on social media talk about World War III and what would that mean for our society. Very scary stuff. Unfortunately, today, we are yet a step closer to that becoming a reality. We must collectively wake up. We must, as a people, hold our elected officials accountable. We must always voice our concerns about war, and we must stand up for freedom of speech, especially during these scary times. In the new world, things happen fast. An attack from Iran could reach Israel within 6 to 8 minutes. A cyber attack could knock out our grid instantly, which would bring upon a loss of power, a loss of energy, a loss of communication, which would mean famine and blood in the streets. If we can use history as our guide, we can learn from our past mistakes. As humans, if we learn from history and use it as a tool to predict the future, you will begin to realize that the words I speak today could in fact become our new reality. My guest today is Jeremy Ryan Slate, host of the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show, an expert on the Roman Empire. We will talk about the past and see what that means for our future. Whether you're watching today on your phone, your computer, or your television, I ask that you turn it up now and pay attention, because what we're about to learn should wake us up. What we're about to experience will give us knowledge, and knowledge is power. As someone much more enlightened than me once said, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. Jeremy Ryan Slate, fresh off the airplane from New Jersey. Welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, thank you for having me, man.
Thanks for coming in. So obviously, as I said in my opening, it is very difficult times on the planet right now. Things happening in Russia with Ukraine, things happening in the Middle East. We didn't even mention Venezuela, amongst numerous other things. If we look back on history, how can we begin to draw parallels to the Roman Empire and what's happening right now?
Well, I think the important thing to understand first and foremost, because I think people often use the phrase that history repeats, and it's not necessarily true. I think history rhymes. It doesn't repeat. So we see a lot of similar patterns repeat through time. And when you look at Rome, I think the major confusion is, and I hear this from people so often, Julius Caesar was the first emperor. And I think often the confusion people have is they don't understand that Rome is actually 3 unique periods in time. It's a kingdom first, it's a republic, and then it's an empire. And it lasts almost 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years, actually. So I think when you look at it, the interesting thing is our political system seems to be going through the fall of Rome's republic, but our actual economic system seems to be going through the fall of Rome's empire. And the thing to me that's very troubling about that is I think you can survive one of those, but 2 of those at the same time, it's civilization shifting. And to me, that's the real concern now. So the people in power, though, are the ones that would have to do something about it. And I don't know that they're willing to, stop feeding on the country to be able to do that.
Even given the wars that are happening, even given our problem at the border, obviously we're here in Arizona, a border state, even given the problem with finances and obviously inflation, there's a sense out there that the United States is almost untouchable, that we're a superpower and we're going to go generation to generation and we're still going to be kind of the king. Obviously, people probably felt that way during the Roman Empire, and if we learn from history, we know what happened. The Roman Empire fell. So what are some of the warning signs? And I guess when I look at like a chart, like a graph, a power rises, it peaks, and then it's like a roller coaster, and then eventually falls. Where are we now, and what are some of the warning signs that we should be worried about?
So I think when you look at it, as I said, there's 3 series of time in Rome's era, and we're really going through republic fall and an empire fall at the same time. So if you want to look at America's republic, I think we've ceased to be a functioning republic somewhere around 1913. 1913 is a very pivotal year. You have the 17th Amendment passes, which means your state legislature no longer votes for the Senate. It's now voted for just like Congress, where the people vote for it. So the states no longer have representation. The income tax law passes, and also Federal Reserve passes. So you have really, we've ceased to be a functional republic, though we kind of have a lot of the vestiges of it. And that's how the early empire was. It still had the Senate. It still had a lot of the political positions. Roman politics was on what's called the cursus honorum, or the way of honor. These were the different political positions you could have. And when Augustus took over, the Roman Speaker of the House was called the princeps senatus. So he took the word princeps, which is where we get our modern prince from, and he called himself the princeps. So you still had the Senate, you said all the functions, but now there was the princeps at the front of it. And that's why the first half of the Roman Empire is called the Principate, because this prince is the person ruling things or making things work. So it still functioned like a republic, but day to day people wouldn't have understood that they really had moved into an empire. They didn't really see that transition. I think we're more in a late 3rd century period of Rome. In the third century of Rome, they have inflation is 15,000% by 284. They have some major border issues because, once again, the Romans had been trying to repatriate their army by bringing in barbarian tribes, and they'd also, in 212, given citizenship to 30 million people in the provinces, 30 million free people in the provinces. So you have really the idea of all of these new people coming in, they're not essentially Roman, and you have 15,000% inflation. Now, I don't think we're, towards the late 3rd century part of that, but I think that's the direction we're headed in. So the political system, in my opinion, the republic has already fallen, and I think just playing that out really is a stage play of some sort. What you see in Republicans and Democrats and what they're acting out. I think what we're really living through is the beginnings of, not quite the heart of, but the beginnings of Rome's 3rd century crisis.
You mentioned inflation and you mentioned the border and immigration. And obviously we can draw parallels between what's happening right now in the United States and what happened in the Roman Empire. And to me, it's kind of a wild thing. Like, you're a guy right around my age, right?
I think we're a year apart.
So a year apart. And to think that you studied Roman Empire propaganda, and to fast forward to now 2024, and a lot of the stuff that you studied is actually in vogue. Like, it's on TikTok, right? What was the thing on TikTok?
How often do men think about the Roman Empire?
How often do men think about the Roman Empire? All the girlfriends around were making like these viral videos, right? And it's funny that now we're drawing these parallels. So with the border and inflation, those were issues back then. Is it as bad as it is? Is it as bad back then as it is here? Like, you said, like 15,000%, right? We're not experiencing that.
We're significantly earlier in that process, and that's why I think that there's still things we can do about it. But number one, you have to find out how many people are here that shouldn't be here. And then number two, you have to shore up the borders. And you have to stop what's happening with our money. Now, the problem is, you had Nixon took us off the gold standard in the 70s, so our money isn't really based on anything. It's based on the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which doesn't really seem to be doing so well anymore. You'd have to get it back on some sort of standard. Now, I don't know if that's gold, I don't know if that's crypto, I don't know what it is, but the problem is we've been so far over our skis for so long, it's going to be extremely painful if you have to base our money on something. So it would have to be, and this I think goes along with what President Trump has been talking about recently, raising tariffs on imports to the country, because you would have to bring industry back at the same time that you handle currency, or currency is going to collapse because you're not going to be able to pay for anything.
A lot of people talk about, and I talk to a lot of voters, we're obviously in a swing state, it's an election season right now.
Sure.
And a lot of people say, well, Billy, I'm just not that tapped in. I'm not tuned in because at the end of the day, whoever the hell the senator is, or whoever the president is, or whatever it might be, the congresswoman, congressman, it doesn't affect me. I don't care. It doesn't affect my family, because guess what? My alarm goes off at 5 a.m. I still got to go to work. I still got to pay my electricity bill. On the other hand, a lot of people think that our leaders really do impact our lives. What was it like back then? Because when we study the Roman Empire and we read into it, they talk about the leaders. They talk about the rise and fall and assassinations and all of the stuff, the propaganda happening around the leaders. Were the leaders really important to the common people back then?
So, and it changes dramatically, right? So I think that you could say it's totally one way, but this changes over time. you have Augustus as your first emperor, and he really establishes the new thing, which becomes the Principate or the Empire. The empire has two parts to it. The early empire is called the Principate. The later empire under Diocletian is called the Dominate. And that's mainly because the person in charge no longer wanted to be called a prince. He wanted to be called a dominus, which means lord. So that's the real change in how the empire functions. But when you look early on, you have these early emperors which are decent, right? Like Augustus does a great job. Tiberius is kind of Caligula, who's the third one after him, who actually would have been born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The name Caligula actually means bootykins. It was a nickname when his father Germanicus used to take him on military campaigns as a kid. But the thing that happens during Caligula is the Praetorian Guard is a group they had been kind of this special military unit under Augustus. And then he actually takes them and puts them in charge of protecting the emperor. But they also pick up other positions. Like they had policing jobs at some point in time. They controlled other things inside the empire. So they have a very important, I guess, kind of like establishment job that they do under Augustus. What happens under Caligula is he has a 5-year reign where he's crazy, right? And once again, we're going off of history that's written. So was he? We don't know. This is what historians wrote about him. But the Praetorian Guard actually masterminds a plot to kill him. They kill his wife, they kill his child, and that ends the line. Now they replace him with his uncle Claudius. If you've ever seen the Robert Graves show, I, Claudius, it's based on this. They replace him with Claudius, who's his uncle, and he kind of becomes like the Praetorian Guard's candidate. Now, the thing that's interesting in Roman history is the Praetorian Guard will kind of step back, and when things aren't going well, they'll step back in. Mm-hmm. And I think this is very similar to how you see, like, okay, well, we don't like Kennedy, let's get rid of him, or we don't like Nixon, let's get rid of him, or, maybe Biden should retire, right? So, like, I think it's very similar to how you see this kind of power behind the power that comes back into, the light of things, and they don't like things going well. So, they assassinate Caligula. They take out Nero. Later on, you'll see there's an assassination of Caracalla in, I think, 219 or something like that. There's Aurelian, who reunites the empire in the 270s. He's possibly taken out by the Praetorian Guard. So it really is this power behind the power where the emperor is important, but to a certain standpoint, it's the power behind him that's actually more important.
So this group is basically equivalent to our modern day Secret Service.
Not even that. I would call them more similar to like a deep state.
Deep state.
And the reason I would say that is because you have to understand, like, it's not exactly like the only thing they didn't do was protect the emperor. Like, they did more than that. They had some things related to the grain supply. They had some things related to policing, economics. So they had other positions they were doing, and they really become kind of this establishment group. So you could say it's kind of like a combination of your Secret Service and your FBI and your DOJ, and they handle a lot of these different functions.
But when they want somebody out of power, through whether it be physical means or political means, yes, they get rid of them. And I don't think that that's a conspiracy here in our country. And I'm not talking about the recent attempt on President Trump's life, which there is a lot of conspiracy theories there too online. But I'm talking more about, as you mentioned, JFK and Biden and Nixon, when they want you out. And actually, I think it's really clearly illustrated.
Well, it goes back
Biden.
to the quote from Chuck Schumer when he said, if you cross the CIA, they have, 10 ways to Sunday to take care of you, what talked about Trump early on.
They'll take care of you.
Yeah.
I want to talk about President Trump and look at his parallels to history. So a lot of people have compared President Trump to two historical figures that I've seen. So number one would be Hitler. We've seen those comparisons. We even see...
Everybody loves that comparison with any character, I've noticed throughout history.
But we can definitely see it from President Trump. We've seen a lot of his enemies compare him to Hitler. We've also seen him compared to Caesar. Mm-hmm. I want to focus more on Caesar.
Okay.
Are there any parallels between Donald Trump and Julius Caesar? And if not, who would you compare him to historically?
So I think, first of all, you have to understand who Julius Caesar is. So this is going to take a little bit of an explanation. So allow me this explanation. So Julius Caesar is... by birth, he's a patrician, right? So his family is wealthy, but he personally has no money. His father had lost a lot of money in speculative investments, and basically he's bankrolled by a guy named Marcus Crassus. So every decision Caesar makes in his life is based on, am I going to lose all the money and have to actually pay Crassus back, and I don't have money to pay him. So in 59 BC, Julius Caesar is going to be what's called consul. Consul is similar to being a president, but there would be two of them at once, because Romans didn't want one person to hold power. They feared kings. So in the year of the consulship, they would call it the people's names. For example, that year, the two consuls are Julius Caesar and Marcus Biblius. It would have been called the consulship of Caesar and Biblius. Now, the problem that happens is one of the first motions that Caesar makes is to give land to veterans, a very populous thing. He also handles different things with taxes. He handles the grain supply a little bit better. So he makes a lot of very populist reforms. Now, Biblius, who is ruling with Caesar, the guy behind him is an enemy of Caesar. His name is Cato the Younger. And his very famous relative would have been the same guy during the Punic War that said Carthago delenda est, or Carthage must be destroyed. He's much less impressive than his historical character. But Caesar and Cato were kind of going back and forth, and Biblius is just behind that. So these reforms come in. Cato uses Biblius to block them. So what happens is there was a tribunician power where basically Caesar could now take a vote to the people. And he circumvents his consul that he's consul with. And the people vote for these reforms. He's able to put them into motion. So what happens is people actually chase Biblius into his home. So for the entire year, Biblius is not serving in office. He's actually in his home hiding from the people. So they end up calling it the year of Julius and Caesar, rather than the consulship of Caesar and Biblius. So for that year, he's in power. The consulship ends after a year. And during the year when you're consul, you are immune from any type of political or legal persecution or prosecution. Like, that just doesn't happen. After that time period, he takes 9 years, and he's what's called a proconsul. That means somebody who's a consul outside of Roman territory. So he leads an army for 9 years and conquers Gaul. And he is a genocidal maniac for those 9 years in Gaul. He kills close to 1 million people. But he enlarges Rome by bringing in modern-day France, Germany, Belgium, a lot of these areas. After that period ends, he hears through the grapevine that now Cato the Younger wants to bring him up on charges for crimes he may have committed during his year as consul and his year in his 9 years serving in Gaul. When Caesar hears this, he wants to once again be consul, because if he is, whether he did something or didn't do something wrong, they can't charge him if he's consul again. So he gets a special dispensation from the Senate because Rome's politics were in person. So he would have to appear in person to be elected. And if he appears in person, well, they're going to be able to charge him, right? So he gets a special dispensation from the Senate to be elected in absentia. Cato then gets that bill canceled. So Caesar still would have to come to Rome. So Caesar takes his 10 legions, comes down through northern Italy. He comes to a river called the Rubicon and takes one of those legions, leaves 9 behind, and crosses the river. Rome was surrounded by what's called a sacred area called the Pomerium, and you couldn't enter Rome under arms because it was seen as like a threat to the city or civil war or whatever it might be. So Caesar crosses the Rubicon and he utters the phrase, "the die is cast." And oftentimes the translation people use from that is wrong. He's actually paraphrasing Greek tragedy, which is a phrase that says, "let the chips fall where they may." So he's taking a risk because he's going to see what happens. So he crosses the Rubicon with this one legion, which is around, it changes through different times of the empire, but it's around 5,000 men. His enemies, Cato, Scipio, and Pompey, hear that Caesar's on his way, so they leave the city. He spends 4 years chasing Pompey around Italy. Pompey will eventually be killed by the Ptolemaic king in Egypt as a favor to Caesar, and Scipio and Cato will commit suicide out of fear of Caesar. So Caesar enters the city, and what happens? He's declared dictator by the Senate. A dictator was someone that the office was supposed to last 6 months, but he holds that office he's eventually called dictator for life in 44 BC. He's assassinated in 44 BC, and that's the end of things. Now, the comparisons between Trump and Caesar. Trump is very much a populist, which I think you could say is very similar to a lot of the reforms of Caesar. Caesar was broke. Trump has not been broke unless, he did lose money in his time in office by a lot of things that happened to him. Caesar never lays down power. Trump may not have agreed with the results of the election, but he leaves office. So I think if you look at it, there's some comparisons that are there, but I think really that Republic comparison doesn't matter as much as the enemies of Trump want to make it seem as. If you want to compare him more to a historical figure, I think he has the ability to be more like someone like Diocletian. It's good and it's bad because, as I said, Diocletian is the guy that takes the title of Lord, right? So it becomes kind of a more direct control empire than the previous principate, but he tries monetary reforms, he does taxation reforms, he changes the way that the empire is run, so it's kind of broken up into more smaller pieces, similar to how our states are run. So if you want to see what could be good, it could be those aspects of things. Now, being called a dominus is not great, and also he persecutes Christians on a really grand scale as well, which is not a great thing.
It's amazing to me that Jeremy,
I apologize for the long-winded explanation.
I like that.
I think it was important.
I love that. Jeremy Ryan Slate, it's amazing to me that in history class growing up in school, I couldn't have cared less about any of this stuff. And now sitting here, I'm like fascinated by all this stuff. Like my brain is firing on all cylinders, and it's really fascinating.
Well, I think the important part about Caesar too is one of the first things he does when he becomes dictator in 46 BC is he pardons his enemies. And that'll actually come to bite him in the butt later, because those enemies are actually the ones that end up becoming a part of that assassination plot in 44 BC. And a lot of what we know about him, other than his time in Gaul, because he did write extensively about that, he also did write about the Roman Civil War after that. But a lot of what we know about him is actually written by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who's one of his enemies that outlives him. So I think it's important to understand the opinion you have about Caesar most likely comes from someone that didn't like him.
And I think that Trump should pardon Hunter Biden. I've said that on the show a bunch of times, because I think it would give sort of a show of, hey, put your swords down, the war is over, and let's move on. I think if he gets in office,
it can only escalate if you don't do that. I think that's what's important to understand is, and I don't know if you know Ian Crossland, but I've spoken to Ian about this numerous times. Like, you have to, at some point in time, you have to ratchet it down. Because if you keep ratcheting it up, it's not heading in a good direction.
Well, we saw that with the attempt on his life. I want to bring it back to modern day here for a moment. You're not only a historian, but you're, in having dinner with you last night, you're a brilliant political mind. And we kind of started to talk about predicting things.
I don't know if I'd say brilliant, by the way.
Well, I'll say it. You don't have to. So what I'm interested in is what could potentially happen to our great nation, again, to learn from history, that would accelerate a problem, that would accelerate a fall? So we mentioned the wars that are happening in the world, but I want to talk about things like, obviously there's natural disasters, right? We could have an asteroid or something we can't control.
Well, and I think that is something important to understand as well, because in the 3rd century, Rome was experiencing a plague. They had a dramatic climate change issue that occurs. They have what's called the Roman climate optimum, I think is what it's called, and it lasts from about 200 BC to the early 3rd century, and that's where they could more easily get grain, because Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, so that would be where a lot of the grain would come from. The climate changes dramatically. You have a plague that comes in, and you have all this economic upheaval.
So things that are out of the people's or the powers that be control, something like a plague, food issues, or natural disasters. We've seen COVID. COVID could have been 10x. If COVID was 10x, we could have seen a lot more death and a lot more destruction. We think about an asteroid, but I want to get to like a cyber attack, right? A lot of people are worried about like a Chinese cyber attack, and the banking system goes down. You can imagine the power grid goes down, which means energy goes down, gasoline. We have a famine, something like that. If we did in our lifetime have a massive attack on our grid, what does history tell us about how the people would react? Especially considering we are a very armed nation.
Well, I think one part of it is, and Jack Posobiec has been talking about this for years, you got to get out of cities. I think that is the number one place you don't want to be if things don't go well, because there's going to be resources people can't get. They don't know how to provide those resources for themselves. And you look at what happened under Hurricane Katrina, right? Like, look at how quickly they went to looting and things got out of control. And I think if you want to see that at a grand scale, like imagine that, and imagine what happened during Katrina, or during the George Floyd riots of 2020. Imagine that on a grand scale in every city in America. Like, so you do not want to be in a city if something like that goes down.
So people that live outside of cities in the countryside, and there's a lot of people that actually, before COVID, we would kind of make fun of them, right? They call them preppers. And they're buying all this, huge boxes of food and the ammunition and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's not really funny anymore.
Well, I think, so here's the thing I have to say about that. I think it's important to be prepared, but I do think some people kind of go like over the edge, if that makes sense. I don't think you need a end of the world bunker, but I do think you need to have food for a good 6 months. I think it's important to have.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, Jeremy Ryan Slate, about your life now.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, you studied this stuff. Obviously, my audience can tell you're very well educated. You know this stuff in and out.
There's somebody out there in your YouTube audience that is going to tell me I know nothing now.
Comment below about everything that Jeremy got wrong about the Roman Empire. But I guess my question is, how has this been for you, this ride over the last year, where the Roman Empire started trending and it's become, like I said, en vogue, and now all of a sudden people want to talk to you all over the country about this stuff? I mean, you could have never anticipated this newfound fame.
Yeah, my wife likes to tell me I'm suddenly relevant. I'm like, honey, I wasn't relevant before. This whole men thinking about the Roman Empire thing popped up around September or October of last year. And while it's a portent of things to come, I think at the same time I'm having a great time talking about it because it makes that college degree I got look really useful that I wasn't using in the last 15 years of my life. So I think it's important to discuss history and understand the lessons it has to teach us, because if we don't discuss them, we're going to make those same mistakes. And that's the thing I'm finding in a lot of these conversations is, number one, people they don't learn anything about the Roman Empire. And that doesn't mean we all need to be experts and we need to be thinking about it all the time, but I think it's a bigger part of our lives than we realize. Like the word inauguration, when a president takes office. Augury was actually when priests in the Roman Empire would use bird signs. They'd look at it and they say, okay, well, how do the birds look today? Or they would take out the liver of an animal and they say, oh, that liver doesn't look so good. So inauguration would be the day they would look at the signs and say, like, should this thing happen? Should this person take political office? So we use a lot of the same terminology and a lot of the same actions in our lives, and I think we've just ceased to understand them.
We've had times in our country, and I can remember, you're being from New Jersey, I'm being from New York. I can remember I was a freshman in high school during 9/11, and it was incredible to me that the days and the weeks after, really the months after, just the support and the patriotism and the emotion and like American flags on cars, everybody had their flag up. You'd go to the grocery store and it seemed like for the first time in my life, we were all kind of together. Mm-hmm. We were Americans. It wasn't a red thing or a blue thing or a race thing.
There's also a lot of danger in that too, though, because you look at the Patriot Act that passes not long after that. There's a book by Glenn Greenwald, excellent reporter. It's called How Would a Patriot Act? And if you look at a lot of the pieces of the Patriot Act, they were tried to be passed 10, 15, 20 years before piecemeal. And those things were not acceptable until we have a major attack, and now we can pass them piecemeal.
Because they can push them through.
Correct.
Because everybody's finally on the same page. And then we look at the Iraq War and no weapons of mass destruction and Colin Powell and all that kind of stuff.
So I think the important thing to remember is in times of emergency, we still need to keep our head about us. And I think a lot of times people don't do that. They get into the fervor of things, or they don't understand what's happened in history. You look at in I think it was it 30? It's the late 1930s, the Reichstag fire, and Hitler then uses the Reichstag fire as a reason to pass the Enabling Acts, which before would not have passed. So I think it's also important for us that when these events happen or when these things happen, to not react too hard or too quickly, right? Like we look at the Trump assassination, and there's a lot of people that have made comments about, was there a second shooter or was the Secret Service involved? And I think the problem is we don't have enough information to make a decision yet. And I think just like after 9/11 or just like after some of these events, we tend to have snap reactions to things because it makes us feel good. And history tells us that's not always the best way to respond to things.
We didn't come together during COVID. There was like a moment 10 minutes after the Trump assassination that I was like, you know what? The Democrats were being pretty friendly. The Trump camp was kind of being pretty
Keith
friendly.
Olbermann was never friendly.
Well, okay. Well, that's Keith. That's Keith. But for about 5 seconds, I was sitting there drinking my coffee the next day on my balcony. I said, you know what? Maybe things are kind of moving in the right direction. Maybe we are going to just focus on the issues that matter and not all this like slam dunking on X and stuff like that. Well, it didn't happen, right? And it didn't happen during COVID. I guess my question is, if we were to face some sort of a, God forbid, national tragedy, right? We saw it during World War I, World War II. The country came together. People, men and women, worked together for the betterment of the United States. This world we live in now, everybody's just right there. They're on their phones, and it's very tribal and very polarized now more than ever. Do you think this country still has the potential, under an extreme circumstance, to just be Americans?
That's a really good question, and my concern is that we've become too charged up on a lot of issues. Like if you look at, the mid-90s versus now, things have gotten there's become red areas and blue areas in the country when I think a lot of the country used to be purple. So my concern is that I don't know if we can handle something major happening again. And I think that's something that it gets back to getting involved in your local community. It involves communication, and these are things that we've forgotten about and we don't remember how to do. And unless we remember what it's like to be human beings, and unless we start helping each other out, it's not going to get any better, man. Like, that's something that's a real problem.
You've studied assassinations on leaders throughout history. If that bullet that President Trump took in the ear goes literally, we're talking what, half an inch
to an inch, yeah.
Half an inch to an inch to the right, and God forbid he catches that bullet and passes. Given history, does our country survive that? I mean, is that too extreme to say? Does our culture survive that? Is there some sort of a civil war, or is the news cycle so fast that we mourn, move on, and we're on to the next one? I mean, I don't know. I don't mean to sound insensitive, but I'm just being truthful and trying to think about what the reality would have been. And I think that's okay to bring up because, damn it, we were really close.
Well, I think there's two different ways you could look at this. I think number one, you could look at how the left responded after 2020. And you can look at after that happened to Trump, like there were no riots in the streets. People were, they were upset, they were incensed, but you weren't seeing a lot of those things. So I think understanding that the two sides do react differently, and I'm not saying the Republican Party is the answer, because I think there are a lot of the problems we have as well, whether it's the money in politics or whatever it might be. But there's also a part of me as well. Are you familiar with the concept of the Hegelian dialectic?
No, I'm not.
So the Hegelian dialectic, you get a problem, reaction, solution. And oftentimes in government, they have a solution in mind. They're just looking for the right reaction to a problem to be able to co-opt that solution. So to me, I think I would be concerned of, okay, well, does the FBI cause some sort of event? Once again, I'm out on a limb on this one, but does the FBI cause some sort of event like they did in the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping, where it turned out, the guys trying to kidnap Governor Whitmer, 2/3 of them were FBI informants. So does something happen because the government has some other policy they want to pass? So there's kind of two sides to this, where I think had something happened to him, would people have been incensed? Yes. I don't think there would have been rioting in the streets, but I would also be concerned with what bigger problem would this solve for the government of regulation or control or whatever it might be.
It freaks me out. And I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Mm-hmm. We were literally just so close to something unimaginable. And I wasn't alive for the JFK assassination. Sure. And I've asked my parents about it, and just the overall mourning and sadness in the country. And I just think, even to this day, would we still have that mourning and 100% sadness in this kind of patriotic
I don't think we would.
I don't think we would either.
There was a lot of people that actually, were reprimanded or lost their jobs for saying, I wish the guy was more accurate. Right. So I think that the problem is we've become so polarized as people that we've learned to hate our neighbor. Yeah. And I think that's a real problem. You and I were talking about this yesterday. I think it's become a real problem when we've been told to hate our neighbor and we forget that people are people.
There's a concept that I want to talk about with you, and I've tried to wrap my head around it, but you're the guy to ask. It's called the fourth turning, and okay. I believe it's a book as well.
Yeah.
Could you explain what the fourth turning is?
So I'm not going to do it 100% justice. The author is Neil Howe, I believe is his name, and he had a co-author that's since passed, but it's the idea that history goes through cycles, and there's somewhere between 80 and 100 years. And there's 4 different cycles in it. It comes from the word seculum. So these 20 to 30-year cycles, which get you through 100 years. And his idea is basically you get to kind of the 4th cycle, and the cycle starts over again, and you get the first of rebirth. And he actually just wrote a book recently called The Fourth Turning is Here. And he's looking at kind of a major turning event, which he says, I'm not sure if it's COVID, or I'm not sure if it's something else that's still coming. And that event will usher in whatever is kind of the start of things over again. And you see this really every 100 years, you go through kind of the birth pains of whatever the next thing is to come. And as I said, I'm not going to do it justice.
Does it always have to be a negative? In other words, we've had like the Industrial Revolution and different things. And then we had the Great Depression, the Roaring '20s, and then the World Wars. Does it always have to be, does one part of the turning have to be a negative, or could it be great prosperity that leads into more great prosperity?
Well, according to what Howe says in his book, it has to be some sort of an event of calamity of some sort. You can't have prosperity leading to more prosperity, because it goes back to that thing you and I were talking about that Elon Musk talks about, was it great men make? You have it written down somewhere.
I have it right here.
So I'm not going to take that.
It was a perfect segue. I'll bring that up because I want to know where we are in this chart as well. So it's you posted that, Elon Musk posted this, and you reposted this. It's gotten a lot of traction on social media. It's hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. So I would think that we're kind of more between good times create weak men and weak men create hard times.
I'd say that's about right where we are.
And that's a little scary, because that means we're just going to the last one, weak men create hard times. By the way, it doesn't have to be men, it could be men or women.
Right, but and it's, Ronald Reagan had always said that, freedom is never more than a generation away, because it's when the people that have earned it, when the people that have worked for it are no longer the people around. It's the same way when Rome fell. Right, Rome didn't really fall; it more or less faded out. As in, 476, it becomes a barbarian kingdom, and the last emperor is just deposed because they retire him. They give him an annual pension, but they say, "Hey, you're a child emperor, Romulus Augustus. We're going to retire you." And Odoacer, the barbarian king of the Visigoths, is the new king of Italy. And what really ends up happening is they don't know how the aqueducts are built. They don't know how Roman plumbing works. And as you get generations away from these things and you don't have the ability to create those things or repair those things, you're not going to have those things anymore. And they call it the Dark Ages. It's called the Dark Ages just literally because there wasn't as much literacy. It wasn't actually because it was a terrible time, but we don't have as much literacy. We don't have as much engineering. And I think if you compare that to where we are now, unless we start to handle our situation, what comes after is not great.
Well, it's fascinating. This whole conversation is fascinating. And I'm really grateful to just talk to you, Jeremy Ryan Slate. And I'm grateful that you traveled to Arizona and enlightened me today and our audience. I think it's important for us all collectively to kind of take a beat, take a deep breath.
Yeah.
The news cycle just goes so fast. I mean, we had an attempted assassination. We had a sitting president.
Well, look at the last 3 weeks, man.
I mean, I can't even remember everything that's happened. The news cycle just goes so fast, and we're in an election season, and things are crazy. And I think it's good to just take a beat, think about history, think about how that relates to now, and then maybe just gather some things that you've said today and that we can learn from, and hopefully not repeat the bad stuff.
Yeah.
The
problem is, though, Billy, is I think the two major things you have to fix is, number one, your monetary policy. We cannot keep going forever, and the Fed likes to create
printing of money.
But they like to create nice words to tell you they're preventing money. They call it quantitative easing. That means they're just raising the quantity of money and lessening the value of it in your pocket. Unless we stop doing that, and unless we stop bringing in people at astronomical rates that haven't gone through the correct process of immigration, we're in trouble. And that it took Rome, 200 years to fall. With technology, I think we're moving a lot faster. And I think unless we handle our money and unless we handle our borders, we're really in trouble.
And that was my point. I mean, everything's happening faster now.
Yes.
Militaries with the technologies, things happen faster. Stuff with the currency, immigration happens faster because everybody's connected online and they're able to have these caravans and get through the border.
That's a positive too, though, because at the same time, communication was never this open in the time of the Roman Empire. And I think having platforms like X and places like Rumble where you can have these conversations, it's vital. And I think, did people know more of what they were experiencing, they might have done something about it. So I'm also very hopeful from that perspective.
That's why conversations and men like you are very important. All right, so I want to give you a chance. What do you got going on in New Jersey? What do you got going on really across the whole country? Jeremy Ryan Slate podcast. You've got a lot of stuff happening. I know there's a book. There's maybe a book in the works. Give me your pitch.
I run a company called Command Your Brand, and we help to facilitate conversations just like this. We're a PR firm for the podcast space and the new media landscape. And I think unless we can have these conversations, we're not going to improve our situation. I also have a book coming out next year on the Roman Empire as well. So, if you want to find out more about what we're doing, it's over at commandyourbrand.com, or I'm also Jeremy Ryan Slate on all platforms.
And you told me last night you will not be, despite of what I said you should be doing, you won't be dressing in a toga.
No.
Your next experience.
My friends were trying to get me to go to the Republican National Convention in a toga, and I'm like, that's not something I would do.
Saw that online. So how was the RNC? Was that just like a wild show?
I was actually really...
Kid Rock, Hulk Hogan.
The thing that was interesting to me is it seemed more of a cross-section of America than I've ever seen before. And to me, it seems like the Republican Party is becoming more libertarian in a lot of ways, but it's also becoming more of the Rust Belt, more of, people that are actually laboring. And I think the thing that's cool about that, it's almost like the political parties have switched sides, if that makes sense, where the left has become more the party of elitists. And it seems like, once again, not that I think the Republican Party is the answer, but I think a lot of the people that are being attracted to it now are regular people.
When you experience something like the RNC, does that give you hope? Does it give you hope for America? And I don't mean this like politically speaking. I'm just saying.
It does, and it's also terrifying in a way too, because I've never seen more police and military in one place in my entire life.
Right. That's scary. And did you see Trump with what was that? It was like a bandage over his head?
It's like a bandage.
Was that huge? I mean,
it seemed obnoxiously big. I don't know that it needed to be that large, but
and now he doesn't. If you notice, he doesn't have the bandage on. I don't.
He had it off
after
after like 3 days, man.
I don't even see a hole in his ear.
I haven't seen his ear, so
is that okay to say? We said a lot of things. That's all right to say.
Yeah, I haven't seen his ear. I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, it doesn't look so bad, but he definitely is a showman. And the effect when he came out, man, I got chills when he came out.
Came out to that 50,
country is
50
coming
Cent
together.
Song, Many Men.
The country is coming together, and then about halfway down through his speech, he just threw out the teleprompter, and it was back to the same old stuff. So I guess that's where we're at. Jeremy Ryan Slate, I appreciate you. Jeremy Ryan Slate on X and on Instagram, right?
Yeah.
We'll be out there. We're going to put a lot of reels out and a lot of clips from this interview. I love your knowledge, and knowledge is power. So thank you so much for being on the show today. Make sure you like, subscribe, and definitely go check out this guy. He's one of the best in the business.
Thanks for having me.
Bye now.